You old man, you should be grateful. We pay you too much for your age.
Cut my salary if you want. Just remember who kept this company alive long enough for you to join.
The moment my screen blinked red with a pay update alert, I felt something inside me jolt like a trap had snapped shut around my name. My cursor froze over a number that shouldn't have existed. My new salary 22% lower than it had been that morning. For a second, I wondered if the system glitched. Then I saw the subject line, compensation adjustment, effective immediately. The shock hit so cleanly, it felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under my chair. If you're watching this, I hope you're taking good care of your health. Tell me, where are you listening from? I always read every comment, and it means more than you know. And honestly, I was surprised to learn that about 95% of you who watch these stories haven't subscribed yet. It truly stunned me. If you enjoy these moments we share, it would mean a lot if you hit that subscribe button. Now, back to the moment everything shifted, only hours earlier. Spencer Colt, our 32-year-old CEO who spoke with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no, had stood in the middle of the conference room, bragging to the whole leadership team. Winston should be grateful, he said, smirking like he'd cracked a joke worth laughing at. His salary is already too high, considering his age. The room offered him polite chuckles. I sat there, a 47-year-old engineer who had saved this company $7 million, wondering when exactly competence became optional for executives. Now, staring at the email. I felt that same laugh ringing in my ears, only sharper, colder. I waited for someone to say something, to glance over, to acknowledge the absurdity. Nothing. The office around me settled into that specific kind of silence people use when they don't want to be associated with the soon-to-be-buried. No eye contact, no sympathy, just distance. I breathed out slowly, letting the shock cool into something drier, almost brittle. Impressive, I murmured to myself. At least they skipped the fake performance review. The sarcasm helped, but only on the surface, beneath it. A quiet sting spread through my chest, an ache born from loyalty meeting betrayal head-on. Then I saw it, an attachment at the bottom of the email, accidentally included by the finance manager, JV Agreement Amendment, 2019. A document Spencer Colt insisted had been irrelevant and long forgotten. My chest tightened not with fear, but with a slow, deliberate calm. If this was their idea of a clean cut, they had no idea what they had just reopened. As I walked past the east hallway toward the engineering wing, I heard laughter echoing off the glass walls, sharp, careless, the kind that tells you it was never meant to be kind. I slowed just enough to catch the words. "The old man should know he's past his prime already," one of the young managers joked, followed by another voice chiming in. Seriously, why was he even making that kind of salary? Their footsteps faded, but the sting didn't. I felt a tight pulse rise in my throat, the kind you swallow not because you're weak, but because exploding in the hallway never solves anything. So I kept walking, jaw tight, breath steady, telling myself I'd heard worse. Maybe I had, but that didn't make this hurt any less. As I reached my office, the quiet settled around me in a way that almost made the comment louder. I sat down, letting my hands rest on the desk for a moment, and the memories came back whether I wanted them or not. Late nights in temporary site trailers, winter storms hitting the turbine fields, negotiations that nearly collapsed because partners were too stubborn to understand their own numbers. 3 joint venture projects, millions saved. Deadlines met when everyone swore they weren't possible. I had held this company together while they were still learning how to format their first quarterly reports. And now, to them, I was just the old man. The sadness sank in slowly, not dramatic or crushing, just a quiet, steady ache. It wasn't about the money. It was the dismissal of decades of discipline, the erasure of the nights I'd carried entire teams through crises they never even learned about. I exhaled and leaned back, letting the heaviness settle into something more recognizable. I thought, so this is the type of leaders who mistake youth for competence, noise for insight, and arrogance for potential. I allowed myself a small, humorless smile. If they thought age was a weakness, they were about to learn what experience really looked like. Just then, someone cleared their throat softly at my door. I turned to see a young intern, barely 20, backpack still slung over one shoulder. He glanced down the hallway nervously before leaning in. "Sir," he whispered, "I don't think they understand the role you played in the technical file back then." I froze, not visibly, but enough that the air in my lungs paused. No one outside the old engineering circle ever mentioned that project, and certainly not a kid who had only been here 6 weeks. He gave a tiny nod, as if confirming what he'd just dared to say. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, but something deep inside me shifted. Quietly, decisively, like a puzzle piece clicking back into place. Most people skim this paragraph, but you don't, right? When I finally sat down at my desk and clicked open the attachment they never meant to send, the screen filled with a document I hadn't seen in years, JV Agreement Amendment, 2019. The title alone snapped something awake inside me. It felt like opening a time capsule. I didn't know I had buried one tied to an era when this company still valued precision over posturing. I leaned in closer, a quiet spark of recognition lifting the fog from my thoughts. Scrolling through the pages, a familiar phrase stopped me cold. Key Personnel Oversight Authority, KPOA. For a moment, I just stared at it, letting my eyes trace the bold letters as if reading them for the first time. But I wasn't reading them for the first time. I knew this clause, intimately, uncomfortably. The kind of knowing that comes from long nights in a cramped legal conference room, arguing over language with attorneys who could spot a loophole faster than most people spot typos. I read the clause again. Slower this time. If any key personnel are altered, reassigned, or subjected to compensation changes without formal reporting to partners, all project payments shall be frozen until the original personnel is reinstated. My breath tightened, not in fear, just in the sharp awareness that comes when forgotten truth crashes back in. I was the named technical representative on that project. My signature sat at the bottom of the amendment, and the part they always pretended didn't matter, the compensation changes line, had just been violated less than 24 hours ago. I sat back in my chair, the initial shock giving way to something more cautious. Could they really have overlooked this? Spencer Colt called the amendment irrelevant once, brushing it off with the arrogance of someone who'd never actually read past page 2 of any contract. But this wasn't some obscure loophole or a hidden trick. It was a mandatory legal requirement tied directly to funding. Anyone who worked in joint ventures knew how serious it was. Still, I forced myself to slow down. Maybe I was misremembering. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Hope and doubt wrestled for a moment, and I let them long enough to breathe through the rising heat in my chest. Emotional decisions break careers, measured ones rebuild them. I wasn't about to let anger drive the next move, so I read the clause again, every line, every footnote, and that's when the twist hit me. I hadn't just signed this amendment, I had helped write it, suddenly. The distant memory sharpened. 2018, the lawsuit threat, the frantic rewrite to protect the company from its own negligence. I closed the document slowly, steadying my breath. They hadn't buried this clause, they had simply forgotten who buried it with them. This is a passage that only good observers can understand. What do you see the next morning? I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in days. Not anger, not outrage, just a calm, steady understanding of what needed to be done. People often assume revenge requires fire, but the truth is far simpler. Sometimes all it takes is following the rules everyone else forgets to respect. So I made coffee, sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the protocol for a mandatory personnel update, the very process we were obligated to follow whenever a key member of a joint venture team experienced any role or salary changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing vengeful. Just procedure. I drafted the email slowly, the way you do when precision matters. My tone was professional, neutral, stripped of everything I actually felt. Dear partners, I typed, I would like to formally notify you of the recent adjustment in compensation and role designation regarding key technical personnel member Winston Hart. Reading it back, I almost laughed. It sounded like I was talking about someone else entirely, some distant employee, instead of the man sitting in his kitchen in a worn flannel shirt, wondering how a 22% salary cut had become part of his Tuesday. Still, the wording was accurate, and more importantly, it fulfilled my responsibility. When I hit send, I didn't feel triumphant. If anything, I felt tired. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled, reminding myself quietly, "You're just following the law." Winston, nothing more. It was the truth. No theatrics, no hidden motives, just compliance. A company teaches you for decades to respect procedure and then acts surprised when you actually do. The irony wasn't lost on me. I closed my laptop, letting the stillness settle around me. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to imagine Spencer Colt's face when the update eventually reached our partners overseas. Would he shrug it off? Would he accuse someone in HR of mishandling paperwork? Or would he simply ignore it, the same way he ignored every piece of guidance he didn't personally invent? My bet was on the third option. He had always behaved as though rules were merely decorative suggestions meant for lesser mortals, with that thought lingering. I went about my morning. I washed the dishes, fed the dog, tried to read the news. Normal things. The peaceful sort of tasks that keep your hands occupied while your mind does its quieter, sharper work in the background. I wasn't expecting anything. Not yet. These updates usually took a day or two to cause ripples, so when my phone buzzed on the counter, I didn't pay much attention. Then it buzzed again and again. 3 missed calls each from an international number I recognized immediately. The vice president of our European joint venture partner. I stared at the screen for a long second, a slow, amused smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. 37 minutes. That was all it took for a simple procedural email to rearrange the entire board of tomorrow. There was something in the back that no one expected. By the time I reached the office the following day, the atmosphere felt wrong before I even stepped through the glass doors. There's a certain hum workplaces have: printers, chatter, keyboards, footsteps, and when that hum disappears, you feel it in your bones. Today, it was gone. Completely. Instead, what waited on the other side was pure, unfiltered panic. The finance department, normally a quiet cluster of spreadsheets and soft typing, resembled a disaster command center. Phones rang in desperate bursts. People rushed between cubicles clutching binders and half-printed reports. A senior analyst stood beside the copier, staring into space as if contemplating the meaning of his career. It didn't take long for me to hear the whispers bouncing around the room. All payments frozen. Every outgoing transaction stopped. Subcontractor invoices rejected. I didn't need an explanation. The KPOA clause had done exactly what it was built to do. As I walked deeper into the chaos, tension wrapped around me like a tightening coil. The CFO burst out of his office, red-faced, holding a stack of printouts. "Where's Spencer?" he barked. An assistant pointed weakly down the hall. Moments later, Spencer Colt arrived, half-confident swagger, half-confused frown, only to be yanked into the CFO's office. The door slammed behind them with the kind of force usually reserved for courtroom dramas. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, slowly, dozens of eyes drifted toward me. Their expressions weren't hostile, just searching. Curious, uneasy, as if they sensed I understood the situation more clearly than they did. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. Either way, it wasn't information I planned to volunteer. I responded with a gentle shrug. The harmless kind people use when pretending nothing is out of the ordinary. Then, the email alert hit every device on the floor, phones vibrating, screens lighting up, an entire department reacting in one stunned wave. I opened the notice on my own screen, though I already knew what was coming. Seeing the words in print, however, carried a weight that even I wasn't prepared for effective immediately. All operations associated with Project 14 are suspended pending reinstatement of original key personnel. One line sat directly beneath it, centered in bold key personnel Winston Hart. The tension inside me unraveled not explosively, but quietly, like a knot pulling loose. A faint, restrained satisfaction rose in my chest. Not triumph, not revenge, just the simple acknowledgement that the world occasionally corrects itself in ways you don't have to force. And in that moment, surrounded by stunned colleagues, ringing phones, and frozen accounts, I felt something unexpected, the first small crack in the wall of hurt that had been sitting on my chest all week. A feeling that said, maybe I'm not the one who should be embarrassed after all. And this is where things get weird. By late afternoon, the rumors swirling around the building had condensed into one undeniable truth: the board of directors wanted answers, urgently. I wasn't invited to the initial meeting, of course not. These things always start behind closed doors, with people pretending they never ignored the rules now burning them alive. Still, as I walked past the conference wing, I could feel the tension bleeding through the frosted glass walls. Raised voices, hushed arguments, the scrape of a chair pushed too hard, chaos wearing a suit, Inside, Spencer Colt was apparently giving the performance of his career or trying to, I later heard he opened with, the compensation adjustment for Winston Hart shouldn't affect anything. Even imagining his voice saying it, smooth with undeserved confidence, made my mouth curve into a slow, dry smile. The kind of smile you give when someone lies badly and expects applause for it. But the board wasn't buying it. From the hallway, I caught fragments of their cross-examination, sharp, precise, merciless in the way only seasoned executives can be when the stakes turn personal. Then, one voice cut through clearly. "Excuse me. Spencer, did you just say changes to key personnel are not important?" Silence. Thick, heavy, humiliating silence. I could picture the moment perfectly, Spencer's throat tightening, his eyes darting to the PowerPoint he probably hoped would rescue him, his palms sweating against the polished table. For a man who bragged about vision, he suddenly couldn't see a way out. A few minutes later, an assistant stepped into the hallway and gestured toward me. "Mr. Hart, the board would like to speak with you." Her voice was polite, but her eyes carried the quiet apology people give when they know you're about to walk into a room full of smoke they didn't warn you about. I entered calmly, almost serene. No anger, no gloating. Just a steady breath and the steady awareness that truth weighs differently depending on who's holding it. The board members turned to me, some stern, some curious. Spencer looked like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. "Mr. Hart," the chairwoman said, "could you explain the 2019 joint venture procedures, specifically the oversight requirements?" I nodded, keeping my tone even and factual as I walked them through the original compliance structure, no embellishment, no theatrics. Just the truth clean, simple, and sharp enough to cut through the room's remaining doubt. As I spoke, the atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a slow, undeniable tilt of gravity. Then came the twist. One board member leaned forward, tapping the amendment on the table. "Who drafted this clause?" Exactly. Spencer's hand twitched. He pointed at me. The room went silent for 3 full seconds. Then several board members let out short, incredulous laughs, quiet but dripping with the kind of chambiem reserved for watching someone hoist themselves by their own petard. And in that moment, beneath their laughter, I felt something powerful settle inside me. Not triumph, not revenge, just control, returning to its rightful place. The following week began with a sight no one in the building expected: a convoy of black sedans rolling up to the entrance, accompanied by 2 translators and a very irritated-looking delegation from our European joint venture partner. Their arrival wasn't scheduled, it wasn't polite, it wasn't subtle, it was intentional, like a storm landing exactly where it meant to. When the elevator doors opened and I saw them walk out, I felt a strange but steady confidence rise inside me. Not pride, not ego, just the calm recognition that reality had finally caught up to the truth. Word spread through the office faster than wildfire. By the time I reached the hallway outside the executive boardroom, half the staff had already gathered, pretending to check emails while blatantly eavesdropping. I took my place near the wall and watched through the glass as the delegation confronted Spencer Colt, their lead representative. A man known for being diplomatic to a fault, didn't bother with pleasantries. And without Winston Hart, he said, voice low but unwavering, this project does not move forward. The sentence struck the room like a hammer. Spencer's entire posture changed, shoulders stiffening, smile faltering, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. He tried to regain control, stumbling over excuses about internal restructuring and temporary adjustments. The Europeans didn't budge. In fact, their expressions hardened with every word he attempted to force out. Another representative slid a folder across the table. "We require full reinstatement," she said. "Salary, role, oversight authority, everything." Her tone carried a finality that needed no translation. From my spot outside, I watched Spencer nod excessively, like a man trying to appease a jury he already knew he'd lost. He motioned to the project progress charts, attempting to defend himself, to salvage his authority, but none of it mattered. The delegation's eyes drifted past him, landing on me through the glass. There it was, that quiet surge in my chest, the return of something I hadn't felt in months: authority. I held their gaze without moving, without speaking, letting the confidence settle deeper. Not arrogance, just certainty. Certainty built from decades of doing the work others only pretended to understand. Inside the room, Spencer's voice cracked. We can discuss reinstatement." "Of course. There's no need for extreme measures. Desperation seeped through every syllable. It was almost painful to watch him struggle, yet there was a cold symmetry to it, like a system finally recalibrating. Then came the twist. The European delegation stood as one. Their lead representative looked straight at Spencer and delivered the final blow. If Winston does not return, we withdraw our funding. The room fell so silent I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system. No one moved, no one breathed. The tension was absolute, and in that frozen moment, I felt a calm, icy steadiness settle through me, not vindictive, not triumphant, just solid. Control had officially shifted, and everyone in that room knew it. There is a small change. But if you don't want to dig deeper, then ignore it. Negotiations began the very next morning. Though negotiations might be too generous a word, it was more like watching a man try to tape together a dam after the water had already broken through. Spencer sat across from me in a conference room that suddenly felt much smaller than usual, his shoulders stiff, his tie crooked in a way that suggested he hadn't slept. For the first time since this mess started, I didn't feel anger, or bitterness, or even triumph. What I felt was simple. Quiet satisfaction, a sense of balance settling back into place exactly the way it should. I laid out my conditions calmly, without embellishment and without apology. Full salary reinstatement, I said. Back pay for the period of adjustment, official restoration of my position as technical representative, and written assurance that oversight authority will remain entirely separate from executive interference. My voice didn't waver. I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. Facts, when spoken clearly, tend to echo the loudest. Spencer nodded mechanically, his pen tapping nervously against the table. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He didn't even try to spin the situation into something noble. The Europeans had made sure he had no room to pretend anymore. Every attempt at dignity had evaporated the moment they threatened to pull funding. There was a strange liberation in watching him sign each page, not vindictive, just clarifying. For weeks I'd carried the weight of his disrespect, even after I told myself I had moved past it, but seeing him put pen to paper, acknowledging and writing the value he'd mocked, felt like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long when he reached the final page. He hesitated. He already knew what was waiting for him. My one unusual request, my only indulgence. The line read, "We acknowledge the irreplaceable value of Mr. Winston Hart." His jaw tightened, his face flushed with embarrassment so vivid it almost made me look away. Almost. He swallowed hard, then scribbled his name beside the sentence he'd once used to belittle me, transformed now into an admission he could never walk back. I didn't smile. Satisfaction doesn't always need to be loud. Instead, I simply gathered the papers with a quiet sense of closure, the kind that sinks deep and settles clean. For the first time in months, I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen, replaced by something steadier, stronger, freedom. As I stood, Spencer remained seated, his eyes lowered. Whatever power he thought he'd had over me was gone. It hadn't been taken, it had dissolved the moment the truth caught up with him, walking out of that room. I didn't feel like a man reclaiming a title. I felt like a man returning to the role he had earned long before anyone tried to diminish it. My place, my authority, my name, back where they belonged. Returning to the office felt strangely ordinary, as if the last several weeks hadn't turned my entire career upside down. I walked through the lobby with the same badge I'd carried for years, nodding politely at the receptionist, who looked at me with the kind of relieved smile people give when the world finally makes sense again. There was no parade, no dramatic applause, just quiet acknowledgement. And honestly, that calm suited me. After everything, ordinary felt like a luxury. When I reached the project floor, a cluster of engineers stood huddled around their screens. The moment they saw me, they stepped aside, revealing the dashboard flashing green, payment holds lifted, vendor approvals restored, system permissions reinstated down to the last detail. The entire joint venture infrastructure had reopened like a locked door finally receiving the right key. One of the analysts exhaled loudly, muttering, "Thank God," under his breath. Investors, apparently, had been calling nonstop, terrified the project might collapse. I simply nodded and rolled my chair back to my workstation the moment I logged in. The team began gathering around me, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of familiarity. For years, they had trusted my judgment. It seemed that trust hadn't gone anywhere. I picked up right where I left off, outlining system audits, recalibrating timelines, and guiding them through a dozen issues that had piled up during the freeze, bit by bit. The room settled into that comfortable rhythm we'd built together. The only person who didn't settle was Spencer Colt. I spotted him hovering near the hallway, shoulders stiff, breath shallow. He didn't come close, not even within speaking distance. If anything, he seemed to shrink every time our eyes accidentally met. I didn't take pleasure in his discomfort, but I also didn't offer him comfort. Some lessons are only learned through unease as the day unfolded. I felt a quiet warmth building inside me, not fiery, not boastful, just steady, like standing in sunlight after weeks of cold. The truth settled in my chest with surprising clarity. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives softly, signed in blue ink on the bottom of a reinstatement form. Around mid-afternoon, my email pinged with a company-wide newsletter. The top story featured a short paragraph praising my consistency, leadership, and unwavering integrity during the joint venture crisis. I almost chuckled. Corporate newsletters rarely meant anything until this one did. Within an hour, that paragraph had somehow leaked beyond the building. A supplier forwarded it to me with a note, "Impressive. We'd like to discuss potential collaboration." Minutes later, 2 more messages came in from external partners expressing the same interest. I leaned back, letting the glow of quiet victory settle. Not loud, not vengeful, just earned. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that deep, unshakable pride, the kind that comes from standing your ground until the truth finally stands with you. When everything finally settled, I found myself standing in front of a conference room window, watching the city stretch out in calm, steady lines beneath the afternoon sun. For the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten: freedom. Not the loud kind that bursts through a door, but the quiet, grounded kind that settles in your chest when you know you've walked through the fire without letting it make you bitter. As strange as it sounds, the worst part of the entire ordeal had never been the salary cut. Money comes and goes. What had stung, what had dug its nails deepest, was the sheer disregard for 20 years of discipline, commitment, and backbone being treated as replaceable after holding up the foundation for so long. That was the wound. But even that wound began to ease when I looked back and realized something important. I hadn't needed anger to fight back. I hadn't needed to raise my voice, sabotage anyone, or twist the truth. I had answered disrespect with competence. I had countered arrogance with procedure, and in a world full of noise, sometimes the most powerful statement is the one spoken without volume. Bit by bit, that understanding grew into something sturdier than pride, self-respect reclaimed piece by piece. Eventually, the board delivered its final decisions. Spencer Colt, the CEO who once mocked my age like it was a punchline, was formally demoted. Structural misjudgment. They called it a failure to understand risk. I didn't celebrate, but I also didn't look away. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences arrive wearing tailored suits and signed resolutions. Then came my turn. The chairwoman slid a folder across the table, her expression firm but warm. "Mr. Hart, given your performance, expertise, and leadership through this crisis, we'd like to appoint you as Chief Technical Officer for the entire corporation." Her words carried the kind of weight that makes you straighten instinctively, not out of ego, but out of acknowledgement. I accepted the role with a calm nod, feeling the path ahead settle beneath my feet, not a reward, but a return to where I had always belonged. After the meeting adjourned, I stepped back into the hallway. The air felt lighter, almost celebratory, though no one said a word at first. Then, as I headed toward the elevator, a young manager walked past me, hesitated, and leaned in just enough for only me to hear. "Sir," he murmured, almost laughing at his own disbelief, "they really did cut the wrong man's salary." I paused, meeting his eyes with a small smile. "No," I said quietly, letting the truth ring without force. "They just cut their own future." As he walked away, I stood there for a moment longer, letting the echo of that realization settle deep. The story wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition earned, undeniable, and finally spoken aloud. And in that moment, everything felt exactly as it should. Looking back, I learned that real strength isn't in shouting, it's in standing firm when others doubt your worth. I'm curious, would you have wanted a different ending? And where are you listening from today? If this story moved you, I'd love for you to comment, like, share the video, and subscribe. It truly helps more than you know. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you'll join me again in the next stories we share.